for introduction, my name is Lana Holmes, and Lana and I are pairing up on this presentation. You want to take it away, Lana?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Lana Costantini with the San Francisco Historical Society. Welcome to our presentation about African American history in 19th century California. Our presenter tonight is Jesse Warr. Jesse is a member of the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild. I'd also like to introduce Len Holmes, who's the president of the Tour Guide Guild. And Len's going to say a few words about the Guild and then introduce Jesse. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Lana. Yes, I'm Len Holmes, and have been affiliated with the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild now for going on 7 years. And we have about 150 guides, and last year we did over 20, it might have been even closer to 30 virtual presentations. And it's a delight and a pleasure for us to be able to share content and one of our guides and his knowledge, his unique knowledge with the San Francisco Historical Society tonight. And that person would be Jesse Warr, and he's got an interesting history from East Coast beginnings, and then he came out to the West Coast and worked professionally in some interesting jobs and has made a name for himself as a tour guide here on the West Coast, or in San Francisco particularly. And so I'd allow me to introduce Jesse Warr, a friend in town. Jesse, take it away.
Good evening. Within the next hour or so, I'll be trying to pique your interest in some of the often overlooked individuals and events that led to the African American communities of today's Northern California. I will try to keep this presentation to an hour, and we'll be happy to take questions afterwards. A little about my qualifications to speak on this topic. I received a bachelor's degree in American Studies from Amherst College in Central Massachusetts, then spent a year at Yale in its PhD program. Upon leaving Yale, I took a teaching job, teaching high school in inner city St. Louis. Turned out to be my favorite job ever, but I left after 4 years, having been admitted into UC Berkeley's PhD program. That's relevant because when I was there, my thesis was on Mary Ellen Pleasant, a woman who was little known to the larger community at the time. She was an irascible, eccentric, colorful, fearless Black pioneer. I'll talk a little bit more about her later. I fell into a job after graduate school with the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library, where I got to interview about 22 people who were descendants of Black immigrants who settled in the Bay Area before World War II. And I've only recently discovered that my interviews have all been transcribed and are available online as part of the San Francisco Public Library's rare book collection. Now, this is the only part that's going to be, okay, let's see if we can get my slides going. Okay. I want to get them full screen. How do I do that?
Slideshow. Up at the top, slideshow.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah. Great. These are some of the topics I'm going to touch on. The origin of the name California, which most of us local tour guides are very aware of. The concept of race in New Spain, which California was a part of, is different from it was in the English-speaking eastern part of what's now the United States. There were Black settlers who were here during the gold rush. What did the 1850 Compromise mean for Black people living in California? Who was Alexander Leidesdorff? What status was slavery in California? Was there such a thing in a free state? The fact that Blacks lived, there was no predominantly Black community in San Francisco before World War II, but there were some churches, and around those churches, one of which was in Chinatown, today's Chinatown, there were a critical mass of Black people. There were campaigns to get the right to testify in court. There were colored conventions all over the United States, and there were California colored conventions, opportunities for Black people to get together to address their issues. Long before Rosa Parks, about 90 years, there were two women in San Francisco who challenged Black people's access to public transit. Just want to mention Delilah Beasley, an important journalist and historian. Then I'll get around to Mrs. Pleasant again. I just learned the other day, so I wanted to introduce you to Sam McDonald, who was a conservationist and philanthropist. And he left a considerable acreage of old growth redwood trees. He bought that land and he gave that to the state. Well, he gave it to various agencies, and now it's in part of Sam McDonald State Park, which is right here in the Bay Area. I had never heard of him before a week or two ago. Rick Penn did a great presentation a few days ago to the Society about Buffalo Soldiers, so I'll just touch on them. I want to talk about the PPIE, the Pan-Pacific International Exposition of 1915. It was nicknamed the Jewel City, and it was a Black girl who gave it that name. I want to talk just briefly about how Black African Americans were being portrayed in popular culture, so you can understand just what people were seeing every day about themselves in the media. A couple of Black first, Josephine Cole and her husband, Audley, I met them, so I wanted to talk about them. They're more in the second 200 years, but at least I wanted to bring them to your attention. And then I will close with Paul Revere Williams, the first Black African American to be admitted to the AIA, the Architectural Association. Okay. Growing up on the East Coast, we were told that this was a California girl. She was young and blonde, fit, carefree. Apparently, she surfed all day and partied all night. Apparently, did not need a job. But I want to introduce you to the original California girl, the mythical queen, Calafia, for whose domain our state is actually named. And this mural is from one of our luxury hotels up on Nob Hill. If you go into the Room of the Dons, there's Calafia and two of her warriors. How did this happen? Well, in 1510, there was a popular fantasy novel in Spain that talked about an island in a remote part of the world that was ruled by mujeres negras, Black women, strong, beautiful warrior women who kept griffins as pets. And any man who came to this island was killed and fed to the griffins. The queendom was called California. But why Calafia? Why Queen Calafia? That's where actual Black history comes in. Many scholars believe that Calafia derives from Caliph, the title of the Muslim monarchs who ruled Spain and Portugal for nearly 700 years. Europeans were aware and often envious of these Moors, many of whom were Black Africans, former slaves or recruits serving as soldiers and cavalry of the Emirates in Spain and Portugal. Most of them came from what is now today Mauritania and Senegal in West Africa. So in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you get images of Black people like Shakespeare's Othello, they're rich, they're exotic, they're powerful. In many Renaissance paintings, the third of the three kings is often Black, clothed in rich fabrics, presenting gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So Black history, actual Black history, is interwoven almost invisibly into the very name of our state. In Spanish-speaking Western Hemisphere, they developed something called a caste system. And this was a way to account for the fact that people of Native American, Spanish, and African descent were in fact mixing and creating new generations. And how do you account for these people? They had names for them. This is this image on the screen is from about the 1820s or maybe earlier in Mexico. And so these are kind of romanticized versions. You have a black man, a presumably Spanish woman, and their child would be a mulatto. And then you have people who were in fact mulattoes married to Spaniards, and so that child would have yet another name. And so this kind of labeling of people, the words mulatto, mestizo, negro were common, sort of official, and still have some sway in Spanish-speaking countries. But I wanted to bring that up because we have to look at the early days a little bit differently than we would from our perspective. This is Pio Pico. He was the last Mexican governor of Alta California, which became the state of California, before the American takeover and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And if you look at him closely, he looks like he has African blood, and he does. And he did not try to hide it. But we don't usually, when we think of Pio Pico, we talk about Mexicans. We don't say Afro-Mexicans, because that probably would not have been an accurate way that the Spanish understood it. But many people who are Mexican are also, in fact, of African descent. In the United States, about 100 years ago, many southern states decided that they needed to take more control over who was white and who was not. And so in America, we developed the one drop rule, which says that however you may look or present yourself, if there's even rumor of African blood in your family tree, then you are not white. And this is a different way of looking at, we still sort of live with that system. And that was a different way of looking at people than had been prevalent in early California. I just wanted to point out that I'm going to talk a little bit about the small Black communities in San Francisco, in early San Francisco. But why were there almost no Black people in Oregon, our neighbor? Well, the Oregonians decided very early on, 1849, to exclude Black people. And this was the law, that if such free Negro or mulatto shall fail to quit the country, if you're already there, you need to leave in 6 months, as required by this act. He or she may be arrested upon a warrant issued by some justice of the peace, and if guilty upon trial before such justice, shall receive upon his or her bare back not less than 20, no more than 39 stripes to be inflicted by the constable of the proper county. So this law was in effect in Oregon until the 1920s. And it accounts for why Black people were not migrating to that state. But there were Black people migrating here during the gold rush. I'm not absolutely sure, but I found this saying that these were Black people who were settled near Sutter's Mill in Colusa, California. And I know years ago when I went up there, I was told that some of the old homes in that little towny village were in fact owned by Black people who've been there for generations. So we were here in the very beginnings of the statehood of California. Want to pay attention a little bit to Alexander Leidesdorff. He's frequently mentioned in Black histories of California. His father was a Danish sea captain. His mother was a light-skinned slave, and they lived in what is the Danish West Indies, today's US Virgin Islands. His ancestry was Afro-Cuban, Danish, Carib, and Jewish. And he was very important in early San Francisco. Early San Francisco was called Yerba Buena, and he established the first public school in California. He owned the first steam-powered vessel to come into San Francisco Bay. He was a wealthy landowner. Well, why don't we hear more about him? Why isn't he as famous as Sam Brannan and some of the others? Well, unfortunately, Leidesdorff died of typhoid right as Brannan was coming into town, advertising the fact that there was gold on the American River. So Leidesdorff, who'd been a very prominent citizen, was buried in the nave of the Mission Dolores in San Francisco. This was completed around 1791. Right as you come into the very first part of the sanctuary, you'll see his grave marker. And anyway, what I wanted to say about him is that he raises the issue of passing. And I think he was perceived by most people who ran into him as a white person, perhaps Latin or Creole, but I don't think he was perceived as a Black person. I don't think he was trying to hide his ancestry, but this happened. I've been told by the Black community this did happen in the earlier days. People who were of mixed background sometimes took advantage of opportunities they might have that darker skinned people might not. Okay. Before we jump to Chinatown, well, let me talk a little bit about Chinatown. Years ago, I was hired to find places in San Francisco that had some connection to African Americans in the 1800s. And I went up to the window of this place because they told me that there was still a window somewhere on the first floor, somewhere here at the front. I haven't been able to go out because of the pandemic and verify this, but at the time I was there many years ago, there was a stained glass window that apparently was originally a part of a Black Methodist church. And there was a small Black community that lived in what is today Chinatown. The Black community in the days of the gold rush and right after was quite small, less than 2% of the population at that, maybe 1,000 people, but they were very industrious and owned about $5 million in property, very quickly accumulated wealth. But then America was still trying to resolve the issue of where slavery could expand and where it could not. And so they, the result was that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, of course, for every free state where slavery was no longer going to be legal, admitted to the Union, there would be admitted a slave state. And California came in because it was as part of the 1850 Compromise, and what the Southern slave owners got in as compensation was the Fugitive Slave Act, the most draconian that had been ever passed. And it basically deputized all white citizens in free states to arrest any suspected Black person. To demand proof of their freedom, they had to carry papers. And if not, they could be kidnapped and returned to slavery. And, you know, we saw that in the movie 12 Years a Slave. Harry Beecher Stowe, who lived in Cincinnati, right across from a slave state, was so moved, as were many people, by this act and so upset about it. It was her inspiration for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the most popular book in the United States in the 1800s, other than the Bible. And of course, there's that apocryphal story, I don't know if it's true or not, where Lincoln welcomed her to the White House during the Civil War with the words, "So here's the little lady that started this big war." So that book had an immense influence on the opinions of many people in the North, most of whom were not abolitionists, but at least it brought some empathy and made the slaves seem more like human beings and not just abstractions. So back in San Francisco, the 1850 Compromise, of course, put all Black citizens in jeopardy. In 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled, Justice Taney, that Black men had no rights, which a white man need respect. Malcolm X used to quote this quite frequently. And in the Black community, the small Black community in San Francisco decided to go about, I think Susan mentioned this in her talk, decided to go and explore what other places might we go where we can actually feel safe and free and go about our business. And some of them decided to move to Victoria, British Columbia, over 400 people, and they established themselves there on Vancouver Island. And most of them were there until the Civil War abolished slavery, and they felt safe to come back home. Let's see if I want to say anything else about that. No, I think that's it. What I want to say about that. Okay, let's move on. Oh, I did want to mention that however difficult things were for Black Americans in San Francisco, they were slight compared to the kind of energy that went to fighting against the Chinese community, which was much, much larger. But a lot of the energy of the white laboring classes and even of the white elite in San Francisco was directed toward confining the Chinese, expelling the Chinese, excluding the Chinese. And so that's where a lot of the sort of energy around race really was directed in early San Francisco. Delilah Beasley, she was a woman who wrote a column for the top Black paper in Oakland, and for the Tribune, the top white paper in Oakland. And she actually went around and interviewed a lot of the early Black settlers in California in order to document that experience before it became, before it was lost. And I really like the fact that she was an admirer of who I'm going to talk about next, Mary Ellen Pleasant, and referred to her as the Queen Esther of her people, if you know that biblical story. And that's a very high compliment. And Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King's mentor, his wife and I knew each other, and she wrote a book called Negro Pioneers, I think it was called, of California. And she called Mary Ellen Pleasant the mother of civil rights in California. This is her. The picture on the left was published in the newspaper. The picture on the right is supposedly her, but I'm really not sure that is her. There's everything about Mary Ellen Pleasant is controversial. Where she was born, she says she was born in Philadelphia. At other times, she says she was born in Georgia and managed to escape on her own as a child to the north. If so, she'd be about the only child I know who was able to come out on the Underground Railroad unaccompanied. She lived in New England for a while, was involved in Underground Railroad activity, and it became unsafe for her, and she decided to come out to California, where she thought she could start a new life. She was married twice, and I think had a daughter, but everything about her is somewhat controversial, and I won't try to cover it this evening. But I think she needs to be recognized because she was, the reason why Beasley called her the Queen Esther of her people is because Mrs. Pleasant was devoted the fortune that she made and her connections with some of the most powerful people in the state. She ran a boarding house and one of the future governors of California was one of her tenants. Was her energy was really around how can I help my people be more free. And she was involved in the case of Archie Lee, the slave from Mississippi who sued for his freedom in San Francisco. Rumor has it that she hid him in her house. She was rumored to have helped women who were inconveniently pregnant outside of wedlock to remedy, or however you want to say that situation. She was known as a blackmailer. She was known as a voodoo queen. There were a lot of negative things said about her, but I think the importance is that she put her energy and she put her money where her mouth was. She helped fund a lot of the lawsuits that came, the rights of testimony cases. Black people were not allowed to testify in court against white people in that meant that many white people would just steal Black people's homes, property, whatever, and there was nothing we could legally do about it. There was a Black man who ran a drayage, I think, a delivery business on the waterfront, and a white man shot him dead in broad daylight, and that case eventually was lost because the main witness was found to be part Black. So we were suffering as a community under a very onerous legal atmosphere, and she had a lot to do with fighting that. She also funded a lot of the, or at least contributed funding to the colored conventions, meetings in to address issues of what needed to be done to liberate Black people in California. What else do I want to say about her? She has a pocket park. There's the San Francisco Historical and Cultural Society decided to put a marker. It's probably the smallest park in San Francisco. It's at Octavia and Bush. There's a line of eucalyptus trees. The house that she lived in with her paramour, a Scottish banker named Thomas Bell, burned down in about 1926, but before that it was called the House of Mystery. Let me see if I can picture that. That was her house in what is now Pacific Heights. And rumor was that there were spaces behind the walls, so as she had prominent guests, she paid her servants to listen in on their conversations so she could get tips on what to invest in and find out what was going on in the city. Anyway, this picture I have gotten from an old family in San Francisco. I'm not sure if it's been widely published, but this was later in her life, and I think this is a fairly accurate picture of her. She was unusual in so many ways, but she had one blue eye and one brown eye. She had a very interesting sense of humor. She went into a store. A man told me that his father used to run a store near Pacific Heights, and Mrs. Pleasant comes in, and she says, "I'd like to see some flesh-colored stockings, please," because they were advertised as carrying that product. And so they bring the stockings out, and they are more beige, and she is not. And she just slapped her knee and laughed so hard and walked out. She just needed that little bit of humor in her day. And apparently she was quite a practical joker. She came to the attention of the larger city in a lawsuit brought by a young blonde woman from Missouri named Sarah Althea Hill. This was a very famous case called the Rose of Sharon case, where she was suing a United States senator, one of the founders of the Palace Hotel. Why am I not thinking? His name was William Sharon, saying that they had secretly been married and that she was owed alimony. And in fact, that case was the headlines for, it was like the O.J. Simpson case of its time. It was the headline for many, many months. And Mrs. Pleasant would come into the courtroom every day looking very modest as a just sort of a housekeeper for Thomas Bell in the House of Mystery. But everybody believed that she was the funding behind Sarah Althea Hill's lawyers. And the case was originally found in honor of found for the plaintiff. But there were other complications and she never really got that money. But Mary Ellen Pleasant had a country house up in Napa Valley that's now called Beltane Ranch. It's a B&B, or it was. I don't know what's happened since the fires. And she was, some of my research showed that at one point, General Vallejo, who lived in Sonoma, was about to be taxed to death practically, and that she helped him pay his back taxes. There's just many, many stories of how she was involved in the politics and the social life of San Francisco. She is buried in Napa in Tulaque Cemetery, which is one of the oldest cemeteries in our part of the state. She claims that her most important contribution was that she took about $30,000 that she had collected from Black people in San Francisco. And she was a regular subscriber, apparently, to Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. And she decided that the only real way that slavery was going to end was through violence. And so she went to New York and then up to Chatham, Ontario, to meet John Brown, because some kind of way they connected, and she was aware that he was planning a slave insurrection in what was then West Virginia, Harper's Ferry. She met him there. And one, Sushil Bibbs, a friend of mine who's done a lot of research on Mary Ellen Pleasant, said she did find evidence that Mary Ellen Pleasant had been in Chatham. But the main thing is that, of course, John Brown plot failed, but he became a martyr to the cause, and many Union troops marched into battle singing John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. She says that when he was arrested, they found a note on him that she had given him saying that she had prepared what she was supposed to do was to ride around on horseback in the area where they were going to encourage the slaves to rebel, and that she could do this even as a woman. She would dress as a man, but in those days, many jockeys were Black people. And so she wouldn't raise suspicion moving about the countryside on horseback as much as she did as she was just moving around as a woman. And anyway, the note that was found on John Brown was, she says, "The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When time is right, there will be help," or something along that line. I've researched it. I can't find any evidence of that note. But when she was buried, she said at one point to the newspapers, when I'm done, I want one epitaph on my gravesite. She was a friend of John Brown. So she died in about 1904, right before the big earthquake. Quite an amazing woman. If she, in fact, was an ex-slave who helped plant the seeds of the Civil War, I think she deserves a lot more coverage in our history than she's gotten so far. But I have to say, she was instrumental in creating a lot of the mystery around herself. She was, after all, a single Black female moving about in the highest echelons of San Francisco society. So she, of course, had to cover her tracks. I liked one of the things she was quoted in the newspaper. My favorite quote from her is, "I'd rather be I like bloody scenes," she says. "I'm not afraid of anything. I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." Okay, moving on. Rosa Parks, of course, is famous for what happened in Montgomery, Alabama. But back in 1863, there was a Black woman named Charlotte Brown. She was from a local prominent family, got on the streetcar. I'm sorry, they were called horse cars in those days, to go to a doctor's appointment. And the conductor said, you can't ride on here. We don't serve coloreds, or something along that line. She and her father brought a lawsuit, which they apparently won and were given as compensation the fare, 15 cents or whatever it was. So I think almost the next day she went on another line and did the same thing, and that went to court, and she again won. And people said, well, why would this have to be repeated? Well, the horse car companies, there were 8 of them. There wasn't one uni like we have today. Each company was a separate business, and each company set its own practices. Why do I bring that up? Well, it's notable, but also because Mary Ellen Pleasant did the same thing in the same year. She brought a case against I think it was called the Mission and North Beach rail line, and she also won. So eventually, Black people did get the right to ride the streetcars. Of course, we know that Frederick Douglass did it in Rochester, New York. It wasn't just a one-off. Many times, Black people were trying to. It was important that people were able to get on public transit in order to pursue their business and their personal lives. So this was not this was a very important milestone for us. Okay, there's Sam McDonald. See if I can find Sam. Oh, I can't seem to stop talking about Mary Ellen Pleasant. One of the things she did was to get the Palace Hotel, which was the most luxurious hotel in the city, built in 1875, mostly burned to the ground in the 1906 earthquake, but was rebuilt. The building you go in today is the 1909 version, but it was the first hotel, as many of you know, to have, well, it was one of the designer of the hotel, I forget his name, went to Vienna and London and Paris in the 1870s to see what was the top of the line. Mr. Ralston, another famous San Francisco pioneer, said, we want really the best. So one of the things they had at the Palace Hotel was on the left. This is the original building. You would come in your carriage, and a light right there in the court. An 8-story. There were 800 rooms in the original hotel, and they had something just startling to people. Flush toilets just had not been actually commonly used before that, and that had fireplaces in every room. And yet they only have one small fire before 1906. This hotel was around for 30 years and never had a major fire. And when the fire did come, everybody was so alarmed about what was going on in that part of the city, they forgot that under the hotel was a cistern with several hundred gallons of water, which they never put the fire hoses in to take advantage of that because they had forgotten that. But they rebuilt that same area, and when you go to the palace today, it may not look exactly like this. I'm not sure when I got this picture, but it's a beautiful, one of the most beautiful dining rooms you can go in, and those beautiful Austrian crystal chandeliers and whatever. But Mary Ellen Pleasant got them to hire an all-Black staff. Now you would think, well, being a hotel maid or a hotel whatever functionary was not a big deal, but it was. There weren't that many jobs that Black people could get that paid any kind of reliable wage. And so this was a big accomplishment that she was able to get an all-Black staff. In large parts of the country, a Black staff was considered prestigious because at that time, one of the stories about Black people is that we were good at service. Okay, Sam McDonald. He was, I just discovered him accidentally the other day. I want to read something about him.
You got about 15 minutes, Jesse.
Oh, okay, that's why I'm jumping. I knew I'd get sidetracked on Mary Ellen Pleasant, but He came to California. He was the son of slaves from Louisiana. He took employment in 1903 as a teamster at Stanford University. This was the beginning of a long and pleasant career with Stanford, spanning some 50 years, with Sam eventually becoming superintendent of athletic grounds and buildings while working on the farm. He took a correspondence course in law and served as Secret Service agent for the Treasury Department, as deputy constable for Palo Alto Township, and as deputy sheriff for Santa Clara County. And what I wanted to also point out was he died in 1957, but he left property in La Honda, which is down next to Pescadero, near Highway 1, down that area. He left more than 400 acres to Stanford as a gift. And this property had ancient redwood trees and still does on it. And that property eventually went to San Mateo County and then to the state. But oftentimes we don't hear much about Black people involved in conservation. But here we have a very notable person from our own community, from our own Bay Area. And I was going to talk, you can look it up. W.B. Du Bois was one of the people, he was the leading Black intellectual of his time. And he went down to see the redwoods and was extremely impressed. Okay, what can I cover in the last 15 minutes? Okay. I want to talk about the PPIE, the Panama-Pacific. This is the Buffalo Soldiers. Those were covered really well by Rick Penn. I like this painting, however. Okay, this was, they basically took mud flats on the northern edge of the waterfront and turned it into sort of a minor city with very large exhibit spaces. One was so large that Lincoln Beachy, a pilot, was able to take one of those old biplanes and fly it indoors. He flew in one end of the mechanics building and out the other. This was a very spectacular presentation that went on for about 10 months in 1915, celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal. All that's left now is the Palace of Fine Arts, though that's a fairly magnificent building in and of itself. They had a contest to name this exhibit. And the winner of the contest was a scene that she's a 12, 13, or 14-year-old girl named Virginia Stevens. And she got a letter from the committee telling her that she'd won and how exciting that was. But when they found out she was a colored girl, they decided she was not going to ride in the opening day parade. She went on to become the first Black woman to graduate from Bolt Law School. These are some of her classmates at Berkeley. Her family owned several restaurants in Oakland that were quite successful right up until about World War II. Okay, so this is the image we usually see of the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. But I was talking to some of these older Black citizens of San Francisco, and they told me about this. It took quite a bit of searching on the web to find this picture. You almost never see it. This was the entrance to the Joy Zone, or the amusement area. Most of the PPIE was educational, but here is where you went to have fun. And imagine that this is what probably the only, one of the few depictions you would see of African Americans or brown skinned people was this giant sort of image at the African dip. I don't know what African dip actually was, but this is what I wanted to point out. The people of this era were constantly confronting negative stereotypes. These jockeys, when I was growing up, you would see these on the lawns of wealthy people in the suburbs. And again, you know, the most extreme view, you know, the big red lips and the blackface, basically, which minstrel shows, of course, were the most popular entertainment in America for almost the last 70 years, the first few years before movies. And then we're currently just getting around to deciding that maybe Aunt Jemima wasn't the most salutary way of portraying Black people. Yes, the pancakes were good, but they give her this sort of dialect of, you know, a Southern uneducated person. And Aunt Jemima was actually, I think, a real person. When I grew up, we had Uncle Ben. We had several products that had smiling Black people on the box. Okay, I want to close out with a magnificent lady, Mrs. Josephine Cole. She's one of the people I interviewed. I went out to meet her at her beautiful home out on 36th Avenue, right on Junipero Serra Boulevard. She was the first Black public school teacher in San Francisco. Her father was a very famous doorman. This was like one of the highest level jobs that Black people could get. His name was Joe Shreve. Shreve was a jewelry company. It may still be there. But he was there to doff his hat and to greet all the wealthy people. And of course, he had to live off of tips. But it was at least a clean job, a safe job, and he got to know a lot of wealthy people. That was her dad. She lived to be in her 90s. This was her husband, oddly. He was the first Black cable car driver. When he was 1941, he did well on the test or whatever, but the union, which was segregated, did not want a Black person having this kind of a job, and they refused to train him. But there was one member of that labor union who said, I'll train him. And one day he was caught by several of his co-unionists and beaten almost to death. This is 1941. So it wasn't just a velvet revolution where people got to move into these jobs. There was always a struggle. And then the last person I wanted to bring up is Paul Revere Williams. And he was an architect, an extraordinary architect. He designed the Beverly Hills Hotel. But of course, Black people could not take a room there. He said that when he designed Frank Sinatra's house, he designed several Hollywood people's homes. He said when he was presenting his ideas to his customers, he taught himself how to sit facing them rather than next to him because he knew they would be uncomfortable sitting next to a Black man. So he had to learn how to do his drawings and whatever upside down. Eventually, he was one of the people that helped design this iconic terminal at LAX. And there's this house on Divisadero, right near Broadway, that he designed that's in Pacific Heights. Of course, unfortunately, at the time, no Black person lived in Pacific Heights. He didn't get to live in most of the places where he was that he had designed. So to close out, I bring us back to Calafia, maybe a modern version, this is Queen Bee, Beyonce, in her latest album. And I think she has a sort of, whether conscious or not, sort of a referral back to the original queen for whom California was named. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Would anybody like to present any questions to Jesse? I don't see any in the chat, but usually there's someone who's got a curiosity in a crowd. We had something over 40 attendees. I'd say since we don't have an overflow, unmute yourself and feel free to just ask the question. Okay, Harry, here we do have a question in the chat, Jesse. Let's try this on the subject of Harry Bridges and the integration of the dock workers in San Francisco.
Joe went out with Harry Bridges all the time. Don, Joe, Harry Bridges, and Harry Bridges' girlfriend was Joe's best friend in college.
Oh, and Harry Bridges was.
He was a white guy that did all of the.
From Australia. They
Jesse,
kept trying to deport him because he was not a Native American citizen. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
question is, what can you share with us about Harry Bridges and his relationship to the Blacks and integration on the waterfront?
I know next to nothing. One of the people I did interview, whose name is Ray, I can't remember his last name, but he had a very high opinion of Harry. But that's about all I can say. I didn't really study that movement. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes, Jesse, can you also answer for it's Linda? Well, how did Mammy Pleasant, do you feel, made all her money?
First of all, she didn't like to be called that.
Mary Ann Pleasant.
Yes, because Mammy was a way again of putting Black women in a box.
Got it.
And she actually, somebody addressed a letter that came to her during her days of fame that simply had on the envelope, Mammy Pleasant. And she said that she was so insulted by that she sent the letter back. She refused to even open it and sent it back to sender. But I'm sorry, your question was, oh, she made her money. I don't put it past her that she might have blackmailed some people. She invested in railroads in Central America. She had a boarding house with very wealthy patrons.
She had laundries too, Jesse.
She had
Laundries, restaurants.
She was accused
had
of
hands in everything. She had, apparently she had houses
Right.
of prostitution that she ran. I mean, she had a wide range of enterprise.
I called her a founding mother. She was doing what all the men were doing. She had a very diversified portfolio, as we would say.
Yep.
But she used her money for the betterment of the community. And it was not just Black people that went to her for help. Right? She was often, as I said, a lot of people who were inconveniently pregnant or otherwise being not treated well by men saw her as a refuge. And that's one of the reasons why Sarah Althea Hill, who had been born into a slaveholding family, the beautiful blonde who was in this famous trial, turned to Mary Ellen Pleasant to help her win this case. And even today, we're not really sure whether she and William Sharon was his name. William Sharon and William Ralston were the builders of the original Palace Hotel. We don't know whether, I'm not sure whether she secretly married him or not. But anyway, at one time I was told that I could meet, well, what happened about Mary Ellen Pleasant? Lerone Bennett Jr., who was the editor of the most popular magazine in the Black community at the time, 30 years ago, it's called Ebony Magazine. They did an article on Mary Ellen Pleasant, mostly based on a book by a woman named Helen Holdridge. And Helen Holdridge, I don't think really liked Mary Ellen Pleasant very much, and wrote mostly gave credence to a lot of the negative things about her. And so I wrote to Ebony under the pseudonym of the Mary Ellen Pleasant Defense Committee and questioned whether most of what was said about her was in that article was true. I don't know what edition of Ebony you have to go back to get. But Lerone Bennett Jr. was out here in California, so he and Sue Bailey Thurman, Howard Thurman's wife, and I had lunch one day to discuss Mary Ellen Pleasant. And he was very interested in I don't remember if Ebony ever published an actual retraction, but he was very open to seeing her in a different light than she'd been presented. I just didn't want her slandered. She deserves better than that.
Jesse, we do have another question from the chat. David Ivester mentions that he read an article recently about Aunt Jemima. Evidently, she became quite wealthy and promoted entrepreneurship by Black people. Any insights on that?
No. Was her last name Green? Her actual name?
David, maybe you could unmute yourself and get in the conversation. There you are. Up, I can't hear you. Microphone. Trying to get you unmuted.
Well,
David.
my goal was simply to say that wherever Black people turned, whether it was the jockeys or Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben, of course, Uncle and Aunt were ways of putting down absolutely adult Black people that you weren't in any way related to, rather than calling her Mrs. Green or Mr. whatever, you call them auntie and uncle, as if they were some kind of way members of your family. It was not a compliment. It was a way of putting you in your place.
In a little bit more modern times, not fully, but can you comment at all about what you've learned about the redevelopment project in San Francisco and the way the Fillmore neighborhood just got completely rebuilt after redevelopment and its influence on the Black community?
Well, I remember being taken to a restaurant on Fillmore Street. It was a West Indian restaurant called Connie's Inn or something like that. And Connie was a friend of my friend. And they referred to the whole project as Negro removal, not urban renewal. And that term was used widely around the country to describe what was going on. And they just bulldozed a good part of what is now Japantown. I think San Francisco, I live in Oakland, but I think San Francisco has renamed the main plaza where the ice skating goes on down by the Ferry Building, because it was originally named, I can't think of the man who was sort of in charge of the urban renewal. And because it destroyed the Black community that was in that area, they have changed the name. Does anybody else know about this?
Yeah, that was Justin Herman Plaza.
Right, I knew, yeah.
Right.
But no, unfortunately, during the Second World War, a lot of Black people that did come up from the South to work in the shipyards and other industries, living in the houses that had recently been occupied by the long-suffering Japanese community. Of course, you know, they were all moved to camps. So the larger picture of what was happening with the Chinese, with the Japanese, with the Filipinos, we're just part of a larger picture of San Francisco's uncomfortableness with minorities.
Mhm. Okay, counting down to last call. Any final questions before Lana gets the last word? We're right about an hour onto the presentation. Well done, Jesse, in terms
Yeah,
of
well
the
done,
timing.
Jesse. Thank you so much. I think you've really provided a lot of illumination into Black history in San Francisco in the early days. And your talk, I think, helps to address some of the misconceptions we generally have about when Black people came to San Francisco. We tend to think of it as a World War II for the war effort, migration, but it really wasn't. And Black people have been a part of San Francisco's history since its earliest days, as you've helped to illuminate. So I thank you for your presentation and thank everyone who joined us tonight, and encourage you to visit the San Francisco Historical Society website, sfhistory.com. We're celebrating Black History Month in a number of ways, and including online presentations, a special edition of our Argonaut, and a number of social media posts. So, so please check it out. And again, thank you everyone for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.